Welcome to Nightlight. Step away from the mainstream and gather around as we enlighten the world and our realities and travel this cosmic journey we call life. Join us as we share with you and provide that beacon that can guide us all to a better way. Explore with us as we examine a metaphysical montage of spiritual insights, covering everything from the mundane to the magical, UFOs to unicorns, and everything in between. This is a time of awakening, of sharing and evolving, of spreading our wings and soaring on the cosmic breath of creation. Come and join with other light-minded spirits as we weave our lights together to seek understanding, enlightenment, and, with a little luck, some wisdom. This is Nightlight, a reminder that you are never alone.
Hi everyone. Let's see. I have quite a few notes here to review with everyone as we get started. Nightlight wants to thank our listeners for the great reception to last week's Mothman Festival show. From what I've heard over the last couple of years, these shows have been getting the word out and causing a significant boost in attendance. Tonight is another annual conference promotion. We have KATHERINE CHILJAN returning. She's the author of Shakespeare Suppressed, and she will be a speaker at this year's Shakespeare Oxford Fellowship Conference in Denver on September 26th through the 29th. And another speaker from the same conference will be Dr. Earl Showerman. Both of them, will share the same stage, as well as you can find both of them in the Oxfordian number 25. Earl is a retired ER doctor, and he's going to return later this fall for whatever we don't cover tonight. We're going to get into that in October, November. Kind of intrigued by how much medical information the real author of the plays and sonnets actually knew. But we're going to get a preview tonight of Earl's lecture. So I think KATHERINE is running a couple minutes behind schedule, but Earl is here. Hi, Earl. How are you tonight?
I'm very happy to be here, Mark, and thank you for the invitation to talk about everything Shakespeare with your audience. It's a thrill to be able to speak to new audiences about some of the investigations that have been going on. I've been involved in this for about 25 years and have really grown deeper and deeper into the awareness of how this is a wonderful challenge to the traditional interpretation of the plays, and that the biographies that have been sold, for decades, really centuries now, on Will of Stratford are rather misleading and full of a bunch of nonsense. So it's an awakening that is possible for people who are interested in Shakespeare. It's the most fascinating subject because it really adds meaning and depth to our understanding of the plays and the poetry when you have a better idea of who the author might be. And the Earl of Oxford, for the better part of the last 100 years, has been the preeminent challenger, although there are a number of other advocates for other parties as well. But I think Oxford has risen to the top, and with books like Katherine's and others that point directly at the associations between his life and the works themselves, and what his backgrounds were, and what his education was, and what his travels and political connections were, really adds to our depth of understanding and makes the place ever more rich. I am someone that comes to this not because I'm a scholar of Shakespeare, because I'm a theater fan. I've lived in Southern Oregon near Ashland, home of the Oregon Shakespeare Festival, for 50 years and seen hundreds of productions there. And so I come to this because I love what I've seen on the stage. And year after year, I get my socks blown off because of the incredible possibilities that lie within the text and the way modern acting companies can really bring that to life still 400 years later. So, again, thanks, Mark. I really appreciate this chance to share.
Okay. I think we're going to have Katherine here on here in a second, but one of the points I wanted to bring up before we segue into other topics is that as we do these, what's become important for our listeners, doing like the Mothman Festival and the Shakespeare, we have the AAPS, 2 shows from AAPS speakers and the Michigan UFO conference over the next few weeks, is that this is a show that's wrapping up our 6th year of Barbara and me working together, and so we're looking forward to the 7th year. So that's a nice tonight's a nice memorial for that. And
yes,
and we also when we were talking a couple days ago, notified me that Alexander Waugh recently passed away, and was really taken aback by that. Alexander was a leading voice in the Oxfordian movement and mentors to you and Katherine. I was really honored to, have a chance to talk with him when Katherine and I did an interview, 9 years ago or something like that, and he has really did a marvelous job of carrying on the family literary legacy. His grandfather wrote Brideshead Revisited, which is like one of those 20th century classics. It like ranks up there with 1984 as one of the hallmark publications of the 20th century. You and Katherine wanted to extend the eulogy a little bit more, and
sure.
I just want to give both of you a little bit more time to explain Alexander's importance to this movement.
Well, let me just jump in right here and let you know that a dozen years ago, we were having our annual meeting conference in Pasadena, and John Shahan, who was the leader of the Shakespeare Authorship Coalition, informed us that he had a mole at the Cambridge University Press headquarters, that they were coming out with an edition called Shakespeare Beyond Doubt, which was really a screed against anybody who doubted the traditional attribution. and that he knew what the topics were. He knew what the design of it was. So we had secret information, and within 6 months, we pulled together a parallel volume called Shakespeare Beyond Doubt, with a question mark, and a subtitle of Exposing an Industry in Denial. And that's when Alexander came forward. He was the mole that set us on about this, so he knew how important it was to have a response to what they were trying to do and shutting down any serious discourse on this. And of course, the volumes matched, the designs matched, and we had far superior articles, actually, and far outsold the Cambridge University Press edition about it. So he started out with a massive influence on us in a monkey wrench kind of way, where he took over leadership of the De Vere Society. It was writing articles, speaking at conferences. He created his video projects. You know, if you go to the De Vere Society website and click on Alexander's videos, you'll see he did 60 different educational videos on topics related to the authorship question. So, and those are just touching on some of the things that delighted him. He wrote a book called Shakespeare in Court. It's free. It's available, I think, on Amazon and Kindle, and you can read this book. And it's all about the fraud of what the Birthplace Trust in Stratford-upon-Avon is putting on us about the birthplace. There's no guarantee that's where Shakespeare was born. There's no information. And all the other buildings, Anne Hathaway's cottage, the Arden Farm, Hall's Croft, there's nothing there. The two things that are there are the Holy Trinity
New
Church
Place
and the Royal Shakespeare Company Theater. So he wrote a screed about that, and it was a marvelous tongue-in-cheek attack on their fraudulent claims. It was quite remarkable that a trust could be created and have so much support, millions of people visiting every year, and yet it's not based. It's more like Disneyland than it is like true historical places. So these are the kinds of things he did, and the thing that he contributed many articles along the way, but his opus is really the major work that he and Professor Roger Strittmatter worked on together, was to co-author a book called The New Shakespeare Allusions Book, which looks at all the hundreds and hundreds of allusions to Shakespeare that other writers had written over a period of time, going back to the 1580s right up through the early 17th century. And it is about to go into print sometime later this year or early next year, when this will be the thing that really leaves his mark with us. So we've seen much of what Alexander has created and offered us. He's truly an avatar in that sense that he was bold. He challenged the Birthplace Trust over and over again, and he debated Jonathan Bate, a wonderful debate, and he was so charming and clever. And he and Jonathan are good friends. He gave testimony in the Middle Temple on a trial, a moot court trial last year. He, was involved in many different ways, and his influence was phenomenal. So he and others of the De Vere Society have done a marvelous job, and it crossed the Atlantic. He's had a powerful influence on us. He's visited with us during our conferences 3 years in the past, and every time he came, he would electrify us because he would bring something new. Now, he was a bit of a mystic, okay, and he had certain numerological tendencies that has taken me a long time to review and digest, that I could actually accept that there are certain clever little things that are codes and ways of, there's a cryptic aspect to this whole mystery that he had a finger on the pulse of. So his influence will go on and on and on for the next decade, I'm sure, and people will just marvel at the fact that we were blessed to have someone of his literary credo and all his wonderful work, his ebullient personality, his cleverness, his sense of humor, and his serious challenge to orthodoxy in a way that he carried us along on his back a long way. He showed courage and stepped into the fire of the dragons of Shakespeare hierarchy and was willing to clash swords with them at any opportunity. So he was a delight in every way, and right up to the last few months, he was still making important contributions, and it was an honor to be his friend and enjoy our discourse. He would take articles that I had written and send them on to Shakespeare professors in England on, did Shakespeare really know the Greek drama? So he was actually one of my agents spreading my word around. So we all shared in things that were amazing, and he's been captured on film, and there will be film projects and videos that will, beyond what he laid out himself, of course, that will feed us for years to come, because he was a delight and an honest man, and a dear loss, of course, to us all. So I just, for the last dozen years, he has been the preeminent proponent of the Earl of Oxford as Shakespeare in ways that we couldn't possibly have imagined were possible before his intervention and his joining our cause. So kudos to Alexander. We miss him desperately. He's so good. He was so good.
Okay, and I think we have Catherine here. Is that, I wanted to give her Catherine a chance to say something. Barbara, is Catherine here? Okay. I may have to just call her. Earl, next, we'll come back to Catherine in a minute. But as we've covered, the Shakespeare Authorship Controversy, we've heard some of the autobiographical connections between de Vere and Hamlet. Your latest writings are focusing on Mary, Queen of Scots, and Hamlet. I wasn't expecting that.
Yes, it's so interesting.
And I would wager my earnings from Nightlight's social media monetization that Mary, Queen of Scots has not been mentioned on any of the nearly 1,200 archived Nightlight shows, and Barbara is feverishly searching the Nightlight database for any references. But
I can give you a little sample right here in about 30 seconds here, Mark. What my paper in Denver is going to be. Yeah. And any of your listeners that are really interested in this could sign up to live stream our conference. Later on, in a few months, we'll actually have many of the videos up from the conference. But if you wanted to actually see them live stream, they can purchase a live stream ticket at the Shakespeare Oxford Fellowship website. But and Catherine's is a separate talk altogether. Mine is going to focus on Hamlet because we're going to actually see a production of Hamlet in Denver at the Center for Performing Arts, directed by Chris Coleman, who's also an authorship doubter. He's someone that has signed the Declaration of Reasonable Doubt. So it's very exciting for me to be giving a paper on this. And what I'm going to tell your readers is that most people think Hamlet was written about 1600, but there is a reference to a Hamlet and whole handfuls of tragical speeches in a book that was published in 1589, a full decade and then some before that. So we know that there was a good Hamlet. Now, scholars will call this the Ur-Hamlet. Maybe Thomas Kidd wrote it. No evidence that ever occurred, and that Kidd ever wrote a Hamlet play. And yet there are references in a few years later, a performance of Hamlet with the Taming of the Shrew or Titus Andronicus. Over the next few years, there are numerous mentions of a Hamlet play associated with a company that's putting on Shakespeare productions. So I have to tell your listeners, Hamlet was probably written, the first version of it, perhaps the first quarto, which is only half the length of what we ultimately think of as Hamlet, the second quarto, that was what was being performed back in the late 1580s. Now, in 1587 was the execution of Mary, Queen of Scots. And part of the story of Mary, Queen of Scots is parallel to the story of Gertrude and Claudius and King Hamlet, where Mary, Queen of Scots, is married to Lord Darnley, has a falling out with him, and then she's accused of being unfaithful to him, and that her lover, the Earl of Bothwell, arranges for the execution of her son, or her husband, the King of Scotland, who is blown up in a building. They missed him on that target, then they smothered him, and then she, within 2 months, marries the Earl of Bothwell, the man accused of killing her husband. So you have an exact historical parallel Now, we all know, all scholars accept the fact that the Hamlet story originally is a mythic story out of the northern epic by Saxo Grammaticus and then translated by the French bishop Amiot. And then that is Belforest translation of the Saxo. That's probably Shakespeare's primary source. In other words, a French source, which stretches the imagination that Shakespeare from Stratford could read French. But there is a historical precedent. Now, it took 200 years before a scholar, a guy named Plumptre, recognized the parallels there, and he wrote it up. And then 100 years later, another scholar says, wait a minute, he's right. You look at it, and then they find more details about how there was a whole propaganda campaign to show that Mary was guilty of colluding with her lover to kill her husband, and then they would take the throne. And of course, within months of all that going down, she was captured, placed in prison. She was forced to abdicate. Bothwell ran to Norway, where he was arrested by Eric Rosencrantz, also a name in the play, and spent the last 10 years of his life in prison. And Mary, of course, ends up pretty much losing everything at that point. And then a year later, she escapes from the castle where they're holding her prisoner, and then placed under protective custody, i.e. arrested in England under Elizabeth's protection. And 20 years go by. There's a play at that time called Orestes that they think is topical of this whole story of the murder of a husband and the revenge that comes after that. And then you have the whole Babington plot in 1587. She's tried, convicted, and then Spain goes to war with England, triggered by that. So there was a huge international crisis around what to do with Mary, Queen of Scots, and her plotting against Elizabeth, and the justifiable regicide that Elizabeth would have preferred to have put out there. She didn't want to kill her cousin, but she had no choice in the matter, and ultimately it led to war that went on for a very long time. So I'm saying Hamlet is topical, that it's about Mary, Queen of Scots. Now, the Earl of Oxford knew of this whole story from the beginning. He was living in the household of William Cecil, who was the man who was running the propaganda campaign against Mary. He was sitting on her trial and knew the details of the circumstances by which her communications were intercepted, and that her subversion and attempt to have Elizabeth murdered and then take over as queen and have a Spanish army invade England was exposed, and that's what was brought up at the trial. And the means by which all that came about was something the Earl of Oxford would have been very familiar with, having sat on the jury that convicted her. So I'm saying that he was in a unique position to know the whole story, and I think within the first few years after her execution and England's now at war, he writes a play that shows how somebody could collude as Claudius did, and then marry the woman whose husband he had killed and all that. So the historical parallels, although they're distant historically, yet they were current in the British imagination and their reasons for hating Mary, who was a Catholic, of course, and that was part of the big differences. So this is the core development that I'm going to be presenting at the Denver conference, and I have some wonderful details that I think our audience there that are very aware of Hamlet. So many people within the Oxfordian community think of Hamlet as a personal story, as kind of an autobiographical story, but the fact that his mother remarried shortly after his father died and all this. But I'm going to suggest that that's okay. That may be true. But really, more importantly, the early Hamlet was a political motivated story of justifiable regicide, and that a number of scholars over the years have hinted that that's probably what's going on here. And I'm trying to renew those arguments and point out that it's quite political. And Shakespeare's plays very political. I mean, look at the history plays. They're clearly state-sponsored propaganda to promote the ancestry of Elizabeth and the Lancastrians. And then you've got other plays that show allegorically some of the political crises that are going on. So the idea that Shakespeare wasn't political is definitely a misrepresentation. He was very political. So that's a capsule of what I have planned to present at the Denver conference, Mark. So thanks for listening.
Okay, well, with your reference to Claudius, the politics of the time, the Spanish invasion of, or the possible Spanish invasion of England, the Armada of 1588. You're covering how power structures, where the seats of power are located, and probably most people in the audience would be very familiar with that with just reading Macbeth. But how can people come to the conclusion that a country bumpkin suddenly appears in London and all of a sudden he knows how courts are run and managed and do all that? So
I would not use the word country bumpkin. I would not use that because he's clever enough to made money enough to build the second best house in Stratford. He got rich through his connections in the theater. He was a partner in the enterprise. So he did make money off writing plays. In fact, a writer might get maybe £5 for writing a play. That would be a big payoff for writing a good play. But that's not that he couldn't afford to buy the house he bought with that kind of an income. He couldn't do that. So he was a member of the company, and they were getting a percentage of the take on that. So that's where his income really came from. So I would call him a good businessman in some regards. I wouldn't call him a bumpkin, but he was ill-educated compared to who wrote the works of Shakespeare. Those works are self-consciously literate at the highest form of Renaissance achievement. He is using sources that come from the ancient classics, both Roman and Greek, and integrating those stories with medieval stories, Chaucer and the Arthurian legends and the Troy book, and then more modern Renaissance literature, certainly the Italian literature that he read that were the sources for his plays. So when you look at the fact that there were over 200 acknowledged literary sources represented in the plays and poems that are alluded to within the works, there was a vast reading that had to have occurred. Somebody had to have a vast library. You could not explain that based on the fact that he had good Latin education, perhaps at the grammar school in Stratford upon Avon. And so there's a great discrepancy, and that's really where it comes down to why people began doubting the attribution, is because you have somebody that knows so much about music and seamanship and medicine and law and history and all those things that are just so beautifully bound up in such ways that even 400 years later we're making fresh discoveries. So I think that the self-consciously literate works are a vertiginous distance from the prosaic inconsequence of his biographical record, and those are the words of Sam Schoenbaum, one of the great scholars that were affiliated with the Folger Shakespeare Library. He is a traditionalist, but he says there's a vertiginous distance between the rather mundane biography and the extraordinary, exalted achievement of the works themselves. So that's where we get the doubt. It's because of that. And then, of course, many other writers, contemporary writers, had good documentation of their education, letters, copies of maybe some of their scripts, evidence that they were actual writers. In Will Shakespeare's place, we have almost nothing. We have the will, and that's about it. Nothing else in his handwriting and no other. I mean, the absence of evidence is a troublesome construct, and so they've built a false biography, what you could call biografiction or fictional biography, to account for all the things. So all coulda, shoulda, woulda is describes where he got all this information. Where did he get those Greek sources, those Italian sources, the French sources? They didn't teach Greek or Italian or French or Spanish in the grammar school. They taught some Latin there, Latin grammar, sure. So he could have read Cicero, he could have read Seneca, if he had his hands on them, but there's no books in his will, there's no maps, there's no instrument, musical, anything that would suggest, based on his will, that he had anything other than a rather mundane, upper middle class life in a rural community. So his connections to theater were business connections, as far as I know. We don't know of any roles he ever played. His name's on a few lists of actors, okay, but that may all be part of the cover-up, you know. And I wish I knew. I wish I had a means to tell you why and how this is all carried about, why this, you know, allonym. In other words, the true author taking somebody else's name who's actually a guy that is living in London at the time, how that all worked out. I wish we had that story, and then it would be the smoking gun that we need. In the meantime, we go on circumstantial evidence, and we find that quite fascinating. And if there's anyone that's pursued this as well as anybody, it's KATHERINE CHILJAN. She has drilled down on these plays and found all sorts of ways of connecting this to a literary web of references and the early dating of many of the things that turn up in Shakespeare. She's saying, yeah, I think this might have been written even earlier, you know. So the dating of the plays is a big deal, and we've some of our scholars have made great strides in that direction. So in my years of involvement with this, it's just quite phenomenal to me to see the resources that are now available, many of them online, and that are just for people who love Shakespeare. It is definitely a black hole. You get too close to it, and you're going to get sucked down. And like you have, Mark, too many books on your desk, too much information. Okay, we all have that problem.
And I think we finally did work through the tech issue, and KATHERINE is here now. Hi, KATHERINE.
Hi, Mark.
Sorry about that. We did have right before we went live. We did have a tech issue, and I do apologize that you were. Had difficulty calling in, but I did want to give you a chance to do your eulogy for Alexander. I know that was important to you as well.
Yeah, it was a devastating loss for our movement. He did so much in such a small amount of time. I'm sure, Mark, you've seen, and of course Earl have seen all the videos that he did that are on YouTube, which are very enjoyable. And he broke new ground. And one of the great things that he did is he discovered that the term Avon actually meant, in Latin, it meant Hampton Court. It was a reference to Hampton Court. So when you have Ben Jonson's elegy to Shakespeare in the first folio, he was the one who came up with the phrase "Sweet Swan of Avon." Well, he very well may be talking about the swan, meaning a poet, of Hampton Court. And, of course, that would not at all apply to the humbly born Stratford man. There's no evidence he was at Hampton Court. And in other words, Ben Jonson, in an ambiguous way, was saying that Shakespeare was a court poet. So that, to me, was a fantastic discovery. And also he came up with the supernova of 1604, and a reference also in Jonson's elegy, which I don't have it in front of me right now. Maybe Earl knows. Do you know that, Earl?
Oh, it is right. He talks about that in his talk that he gave at the De Vere Society last year. But there, at the year that Oxford died, there was a supernova. It's referenced by Jonson in the closing, lines of that introductory epigram, and he was really pointing at the Earl of Oxford passing that year as the star that's now gone. And I agree with KATHERINE completely that the Sweet Swan of Avon reference is to Hampton Court, and that Shakespeare was a court dramatist. Actually, we have more records of his plays being performed at court than in the public theaters. So many of the shows were performed at court, and maybe later brought to the public stage. But he was not necessarily writing to make money running, for the public stage. I mean, the history plays, I think, definitely so. But many of the tragedies and some of the more subtle comedies, they were written to delight Queen Elizabeth and the courtiers. And there was so much insider jokes going on in those plays that they would have deeply appreciated it and really been amused. And I think the Queen was perhaps the most effective at allegorical interpretation. Her cousin, Sir George Harrington, said, he was quoted in 1604 as saying, allegorical lockpicking had become a courtly pastime amounting to a disease. That is to say, they were always looking for the subtle reference meanings of these plays that would present allegorically on the political crises of the day, as we were kind of just talking about with Hamlet. So I think that the idea that Alexander points out that many of his plays were performed before the Queen and King James also. I mean, the year Oxford dies in June of 1604, there's 7 Shakespeare plays that are performed at court that holiday season, and his youngest daughter marries the Earl of Montgomery, to whom the first folio was dedicated some 20 years later. So it was a family affair, really. I mean, and he was deeply loved and admired quietly and cryptically, as Alexander would love to say. That was one of his favorite words. But I think Catherine really brought up something that was critical, and it was not about Avon, Stratford upon Avon. The Avon is about the beautiful court theater where many of these shows were obviously shown. Yeah, and Alexander also rebutted a book by a famous Shakespeare professor called The Year of Lear, and he thought that we should rebut it. And so very quickly he organized several authors, including me, and to point out how many errors there were in this book. In his name is Shapiro. So that he gets things done right away, and I'm going to miss him big time. He was interviewed by Elizabeth Winkler, who visited his home, and her book, Shakespeare Was a Woman and Other Heresies, How Doubting the Bard Became the Biggest Taboo in Literature, is mandatory reading for anybody that's really interested in this whole question from the historical and journalistic standpoint. And she wrote what I consider to be perhaps one of the most important works in the last 20 years that I've been engaged in this, besides your work, Catherine, of course. But it really points out the disparity between what serious investigators like Alexander and Roger Strittmatter and others were engaged in, and the obfuscation, cover-up, and unwillingness to talk about this among traditional Shakespeare scholars. And she really gives a beautiful argument. So any of your listeners that want a book reference, I would suggest it's out on paperback now. Harper Collins, I think it is. Yeah, it's Shakespeare Was a Woman and Other Heresies. Excellent read. Yes, I totally agree. And it's a wonderful chapter, her interview with Alexander.
Yeah, and Catherine, that was one of my questions about some of the latest Oxfordian Shakespeare news, and hopefully I can get Elizabeth as a guest. Talking about heresies fits in really well with Nightlight's format, but it's Barbara's shows that usually get taken down. But anyhow, is there any other news from the Oxford camp? Well, I've been so focused on the conference and my paper. So I outside of Alexander's passing, that's I can't say there's anything big right now. Okay, but you'll be at the conference September 26th and through the 29th in Denver, right? Yeah, and I'll be giving a talk. It's titled Oxford's Religious Portraits. And, of course, I believe the Earl of Oxford was the great author. But
searching for pictures of the Earl of Oxford that may have been misattributed or anonymous. Kind of has been a long pursuit, more than 30 years, looking for new pictures. And I believe I found one with the Earl of Oxford. He a very fantastically dressed nobleman, very richly garbed, with pearl and gold buttons in his hat and a very fancy sword. And I later learned that a hat of the same description was taken out of Queen Elizabeth's wardrobe and given to the Earl of Oxford very shortly after he was released from the Tower. So I think that pretty much confirmed. This was in 1581 when he received the hat, and the portrait was dated circa 1580 at an English school artist. So I think I found one. I think a lot of people agree with me, a lot of Oxfordians. In fact, one lady, Elizabeth Wagaman, she analyzed the picture in one of the Oxfordian, our journal. But anyway, in my search for new pictures, I think I found 3 new images of the Earl of Oxford, and so I'll be explaining it. And just so happens that these images have references to religion in them, Christianity. So I think it'll be kind of interesting for anyone who really is interested in the Earl of Oxford to see him in another light.
Okay, and that Elizabeth Wagaman's article was in the Oxfordian number 23.
Okay.
In a recliner and check out the portrait of the 17th Earl of Oxford in his hat.
Well, you mean it's in my living room, so yes, sometimes I do.
I mean, the black taffeta hat. And when I was talking to you last night, you were saying, okay, that whole 1581 year was, like all these ups and downs for the Earl of Oxford.
Yes.
And then you have the all the hats stuff. See, we're back to what some of the other guests have said, and what Earl's talked about with some of these autobiographical traits in the plays. You can link a lot of this, the portraits or plays, the sonnets. You can. There is evidence that all this goes back to an aristocrat, not the man from Stratford.
Absolutely. Well, I think you briefly touched upon contemporaries, what they wrote about William Shakespeare. And so many of these points are not discussed. I mean, there was one who said, some say that he was a generous patron. I have one reference in my chapter, Shakespeare Suppressed, that he was writing plays in the 1570s and the 80s. There are even hints that he was a nobleman, hints that he didn't want credit to be credited during his lifetime because it would stain his name. And these are what contemporary writers were saying. Actually, a few of them hinted that he was the Earl of Oxford. And he was, of course, a known playwright, the Earl of Oxford, and yet none of his plays survived in his name, which was the norm back then. It was a social code, If a nobleman was interested in playwriting or the drama or poetry, it was considered kind of a frivolous occupation. So he didn't want it to be known during his lifetime. But the big question is, why didn't he get credit after his death, which would have been perfectly socially acceptable back? A great example is Sir Philip Sidney. He was a courtier poet, and after he died in war, and he had a tremendous funeral. His sister printed one of his novels, The Arcadia, and she even put her name in the book too. So, and his full name was there. So there was, a very special reason must have been why the Earl of Oxford didn't get credit. And also, some contemporaries also said that he was dead by 1607, meaning Shakespeare. And the Stratford man died in 1616. And of course, there were no tributes in 1616 or 1617. We get the first Shakespeare tribute in 1623 with the first Folio. And of course, Oxford was dead in 1604. So, I mean, everything fits there.
Okay. There's the time gaps are, really off. 1604 is when de Vere died. The first Folio comes out 19 years later, 7 years after the man from Stratford died.
Yeah.
I mean, a lot of this, the traditional timeline does not add up, and Earl did bring in, well, and you mentioned it too, but if you look at what Earl was discussing about Mary Queen of Scots, we're going back quite a few years earlier than the traditional dates of the plays. So, the traditional timeline is not adding up.
Mark, if your listeners really are interested in the dating of the plays, the best resource that's out there that was created by the De Vere Society some years ago, and it's freely available online, is Dating Shakespeare's Plays. If they Google that and then put UK on it, they'll get to the De Vere Society, and then it gives you the detailed explanation of the possible date ranges for all the plays. And so I think that would be quite remarkable for people to see that the wide range of estimates of when the plays were written. I mean, you have a kind of a 12-year span between when people thought Hamlet was first written. So, the uncertainty around dating is a critical issue that our group is fascinated by and challenging all the time. And I think Catherine and the other writers who have been written about the plays as being much earlier are spot on about that. We just don't have confirmation. I mean, the Earl of Oxford had a men's company and a boys' company in the 1580s. They were performing at Blackfriars. They were doing John Lilly's plays. They were doing Oxford's plays. They were performing at the court. I mean, he was deeply, deeply invested in that. Now, one last thing I wanted to get in, because I know we're going to run out of time soon, and you asked the question about what's hot and what's going to be presented in Denver that would be a particular breakthrough knowledge and argument over the authorship question. And I would say the preeminent move right now that's coming from is Roger Strittmatter's work at a library called Audley Inn in Essex, and analyzing the handwriting and annotations in these Greek editions that were from the 16th century there. And the handwriting analysis, the forensic analysis, seems to indicate that this handwriting was in the hand of the Earl of Oxford, which we have many samples of. And so the scientific basis upon which that conclusion is reached is robust. And that if Earl of Oxford was reading in Greek and writing annotations in Latin and Greek, it deepens phenomenally the idea that he was influenced by Greek literature, which has been one of the things I've looked at for the better part of 20 years. And it just closes the the door on Shakespeare, who had no experience of Greek whatsoever. So there are smoking guns that are going off for those of us that are deep into this, that you can see the association between a man's imprint in the form of detailed annotations that are associated with particular scenes or lines of text within Antony and Cleopatra and Julius Caesar in a history of Rome by a Greek writer writing in the 2nd century. So it is a fascinating development within our community that Roger Strittmatter, who's one of our preeminent scholars who looked at Oxford's Bible, the Geneva Bible, and found all sorts of parallels between those biblical passages that were annotated and underlined with passages within Shakespeare itself. So he's carrying on something forward that is extraordinary and probably will take him a full decade to really unravel completely and show us the miracle that we finally understand that not only could Oxford read the ancient texts and was fascinated by them, but that he could actually write in ancient Greek and correct textual errors in an old book like that. So I find that fascinating. I find that just the most exciting prospect of what we got going on. There are many other speakers that will be bringing good stuff to the forum, and including Katherine's use of imagery, and gosh knows she is fascinated by this, and she's collected so many excellent images and has such a good feel for all this. So, we come at this from, it's a mosaic of challenges to the traditional attribution, and we're attacking it from all sorts of different angles, and it's a joy to be part of this organization and part of this collection of scholars and writers and researchers like Katherine and Roger and Alexander. For someone like me who did not have a background in literature in university and had a career completely different in medicine, to be engaged at this and to see how this is going on is like it's a deep mystery. And, I know your listeners like the idea of mystery. This is one of the greatest literary mysteries in creation. That's definitely a great story.
Yeah, and I think the audience probably would have really enjoyed, I could have recorded the talk Katherine and I had last night, and the Earl's spoken about, the Cecil library that the Earl of Oxford would have had access to. We know the books that were in the house. And Katherine and I are talking about the 12th Night and As You Like It had their first performances at Wilton House, and got really sidetracked into that's the place. I was there mainly for to see where Kubrick filmed Barry Lyndon, and we just got really sidetracked on that. But there is a statue of Shakespeare in like one of the front rooms, and it has he's has his finger pointing at the line from Macbeth, out, brief candle. That whole setup with that statue seems, and Katherine does go into, more the connections, like, with Sidney's sister was married to one of the, was it the brother, the aristocratic brothers, one of the Pembrokes, or so. But there's, why do you have so all this aristocratic connections, and they became the sponsor. The brothers became the sponsors of the Folio.
All in the family.
Yeah, the Folio.
Katherine, you want?
I was just going to say, we owe a great deal of gratitude to the two brothers who produced this incredible book. I mean, if it wasn't printed, we may have lost 20 Shakespeare plays, because Only up until that point, only about 16 had been printed. So on one hand, we need to be incredibly grateful to them. On the other hand, it appears that they fostered the idea that the Stratford man was a great author by including in the preface a reference to Stratford Monument and a reference to Avon. Of course, they're on different pages, but people back then connected the dots, and it was thereafter, within just a couple years or so, people started going to Stratford-on-Avon to see the Stratford Monument of Shakespeare, and from there on, that was it. The legend started.
Okay, and or you wanted to follow up with the Pembroke brothers or the Folio, or?
Well, you think of this. I mean, the Earl of Montgomery, the younger of the two brothers, married the youngest daughter of the Earl of Oxford during the court festivities. King James was very deeply involved with their wedding. He came and crashed into their marriage chamber on the morning after and asked how everything went, you know. So they performed 7 Shakespeare plays during that holiday season. This is the year 6 months after the Earl of Oxford passed away, or that most of us think he passed away. So they had a Shakespeare festival at court, and the daughter, who probably is in possession of the manuscripts, is marrying the Earl of Montgomery, who will later go on to become the Lord Chamberlain. His older brother, the Earl of Pembroke, William, is the Lord Chamberlain during that whole period in which the Folio is being created. And I think, whether you think the Earl of Derby was involved or what Ben Jonson's involvement was, Jonson worked for all those people. He dedicated works to the Pembrokes and the Montgomerys, and particularly identified Susan Vere as a patron of his works. And she performed, I think, in his masques. So you have this insider situation where the men who controlled the theater, controlled what was being, published, and they were deeply connected through family ties with a man that wrote it, who for their reasons, and perhaps for his own, wanted to keep the attribution secret long past his passing in this world. Whether this is a political decision because of the embarrassment that might have brought to the family, and some of the salacious kinds of text you see in plays like Timon or Troilus, where sexual diseases are discussed in great anatomic detail, that this might have been the kind of writing that the families would not want out there in the public sphere, knowing that a ranking nobleman had actually created this wild story. So I think that politics of the time and the control they had between the Cecil family and the Pembrokes, absolute control of what gets published and how it gets attributed, was really the foundation for why we're stuck with this. But again, people like Catherine, Roger, and others, Alexander, they're uncovering things all the time now, and I'm like Dickens. I fear that one day we'll really have a smoking gun that shows us that there was another author behind this, and all those Shakespeare biographies will just have to go into the bonfire or the vanities, because these are stories that are made up about somebody they know nothing about, and they're using historicist kind of interpretations to try to give attributions and why he must have, could have, would have, and how he got all this information and marvelously put it together in these amazing plays and poems. And, of course, the pain of the sonnets. And Catherine and I kind of agree on how one would interpret the sonnets, particularly the role of the Dark Lady and the torment he went over this broken-hearted relationship. And I think that those sonnets are key to the whole understanding. And if you're a literary scholar and you don't have an author in mind who's writing these incredible, confessions, you've missed it, somehow. So there's still a deep mystery. There's controversy how you interpret these, whether Shakespeare was, connected in some regard to Queen Elizabeth through deeper ties, through, ties of progeny, and maybe an unacknowledged royal bastard child or something like that. There are serious people who are in this that look to that as possibly one of the explanations that we don't have this information, because there was a deep melodrama that went on at court that has to do with the succession. So I honestly think those are uncertainties, but I do think that the families had an investment in trying to keep this quiet. And Catherine has looked at this very carefully and shown a variety of ways of interpreting how Oxford was marginalized after his death. So I don't know much more about the historical aspects of that, but that's my interpretation, that it was an all-in-the-family deal, and they wanted to hide the attribution because of the potential embarrassment that Elizabeth was paying him for state-sponsored propaganda.
Okay. And just to extend the concept of validation or patronage, both of you have been supported in various ways by Sir Derek Jacobi, who is like one of the leading Shakespearean actors after Laurence Olivier. So so that's a big honor for both of you, as well as the fellowship.
I had the privilege of meeting up with Sir Derek and Sir Mark Rylance at our conference last fall in London. And, they are such honorable and wonderful actors with lifelong investment and commitment. I mean, Mark Rylance was the director of the Shakespeare's Globe for a decade, and he's won Tony Awards and Olivier Awards and Academy Awards, and he is the sweetest, kindest, and most supportive person. His interview with Elizabeth Winkler in her book is also a beautiful tribute to him, and his feminist view of Shakespeare. He sees that Shakespeare really shows, a feminist, tendency that you don't see in other playwrights. So, yeah, we've been blessed to have those two actors on our. Jeremy Irons has admitted that he thinks Shakespeare was probably the Earl of Oxford when he was performing Antonio in Michael Radford's film of the Merchant of Venice. He was interviewed by Charlie Rose on national television, and Charlie said, "What do you think about playing Shakespeare's great character Antonio?" He said, "Well, that's if you think Shakespeare wrote Merchant of Venice. I think the Earl of Oxford actually wrote that." So it was like a shock to Charlie Rose, So every now and then somebody comes out of the woodwork and offers an offhanded comment like that, and you wonder, yeah, they may never talk about it publicly, but every now and then it slips through that they have their own doubts, and for all the reasons we've already discussed, and what Catherine has written about, and so many admirable authors who do this on their own free will and determination and love for the works. It's like nobody's in this making a lot of money selling books or getting big fees for giving lectures around the country. We're doing this because we love the work, because the work is good, and because the colleagues that we're hanging with are honorable and interesting and committed people just like us, and we hear them bring new arguments and new ideas to the forum, and it can be quite electrifying. You support conferences, Mark, you and Barbara do, and I would do the same for my Oxfordian community. I said, you've got to come to conferences, you've got to meet the people, you've got to engage, and then it'll light you on fire. You'll find something there that really excites you, and you'll go home, and then it'll sustain you for months and months of further investigation and reading, and you'll be gratified. It's rich and beautifully done. I know how my friends who are in this field feel that Catherine is a quintessential example of someone who's been at this for 30 or 40 years. I don't know, Catherine, but you are
She's
legacy
only
girl.
29. It can't be that one.
Okay, all right. Sorry, Catherine. I didn't mean to expand too unreasonably.
But, Catherine, did you want to say something about Sir Derek Jacobi?
I haven't met him, but it's wonderful that he's an Oxfordian, and he is also the patron of, I believe, the De Vere Society. Am I right, Earl?
That's correct, and his partner Richard Clifford is now the chairman of the De Vere Society.
Yes.
So they're very, very involved, and they're at all their events, and a lot of it is done by Zoom, and so American colleagues can dial in, and they're giving a a members-only forum fairly soon. You could go to their website and join the De Vere Society, go to the Shakespeare Oxford Fellowship, join us, sign up for the conference. There's a live stream option. If you go look there, you can see what the program is going to be. You could hear Katherine and myself and a number of other superb scholars. But even if you don't want to go quite that far, hang in there. Look at our YouTube channels. Look at the De Vere Society YouTube channels. It's an unbelievable resource that really wasn't there when Katherine and I first got involved in this. You almost had to go in person. You had to buy the hardcover books. The internet didn't exist in the way that it does today that allows you to have all this possible discourse going on, and videos being produced and learning tools being presented. And I just think it hasn't quite broken down the barriers yet, but we're getting closer all the time. And I hope to see the time when somebody just throws their arms up and says, all right, it's over. De Vere's the man, So.
Well,
I don't think we'll see it.
Because it would be a great time when that happens, because then real scholarship can just explode when you have hundreds, maybe thousands of researchers now looking instead of it's just been a handful of us, really.
Okay, and we're at the top of the hour. I know you have to get back to working on your notes for the conference. Do either one of you want to plug websites or anything about the conference, and then we can call it a wrap for the evening?
Well, let me just say that the Shakespeare Oxford Fellowship website has a publications page. You can click on that, and you'll see the Oxfordian, and you can get Oxfordian 23 for your listeners if they want to see those images and see the argument that Katherine put forward with Elizabeth Wagaman's interpretation. So it's freely available, and everything that's been published except in the last year is out there on our website. There's a wonderful Shakespeare 101 video with Alex McNeil, really giving you a 30-minute, utterly jammed argument about why the traditional narrative doesn't work and why the Earl of Oxford could be the best candidate. So we have great teaching tools at ShakespeareOxfordFellowship.org. And I would say the De Vere Society in England also has. Now, Katherine may have some other sites she would also recommend, but those are the two, in my view, that add so much to our interpretation and provide both resources in terms of articles that are published that are freely available on their websites, or videos that connect you to some of the best presentations. And it's really only been going on for about 10 years that we've been recording these and putting them out there on YouTube. So those are the two websites I would recommend, Mark.
And you can read the introduction to Shakespeare Suppressed, my book, at shakespearesuppressed.com. And also another great resource is doubtaboutwill.com with the Declaration of Reasonable Doubt. You can read that and sign it if you like, and you can see who else has signed it. And the famous doubters of the Stratford man are also listed. That's another great resource.
Yeah, Charlie Chaplin's
absolutely.
One. Okay. So, if you want to stop there, that's fine. We're a few minutes over, but if anyone has any last comments, you can throw them out there for the audience to hear, or we can wrap up the show. So,
I can say one thing.
Okay.
There's another free resource called the Journal of Scientific Exploration, and both Earl and I have articles in there, and it's the entire issue is devoted to the Shakespeare authorship question, and I believe it was volume 37, number 2, so 2023.
And Alexander has a piece in that also, Katherine. So if your listeners really want to hear some of the deeper dives that you and I and Alexander have done in recent years, they should get that Journal of Scientific Exploration. It's freely available online. Sometimes it takes a little bit of work to get to that issue, but every article in there actually adds amazingly to a summary of a variety of approaches to the whole authorship question. I think you're absolutely right. That's a great resource, and I think your listeners would very much enjoy that. If they love Shakespeare, they're going to enjoy this kind of approach because I think it opens up new fields of new understanding. People worry about we should be teaching the children in schools and in universities this, and I'm thinking, no, I think you teach theater patrons this. You teach people who are in retirement, who are listening in on this podcast maybe, who have the time to read and are already in love with Shakespeare because they find the works themselves to be so wonderful, so stimulating. But I think your comment on that. And I want to just thank Katherine personally for having invited me to join you, Eddie, and Barbara in the background on this podcast. It's been a great pleasure to share some of the stuff that we all know and feel about how the Shakespeare Authorship Challenge is such a robust and fascinating subject. No matter what the professors are lamenting over there, they're envious of what we've got. And if you read Catherine's book, you'll know right away why this is so fascinating. So do read Catherine's books, Shakespeare Suppressed.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you, Earl. And thank you, Barbara and Mark, for your continued interest in this problem.
It's a really fascinating topic, and so much of what we talked about last night would have been a great show too. But we'll save that for another time, and we'll have Earl back shortly to go into other Shakespearean topics, and the listeners can go to the Shakespeare Oxford Fellowship .org website to learn more, and we will keep talking about this topic. And Katherine and Earl, I want to thank you both for being here tonight, and we will see